Hi, and welcome back to the Essential Coaching Skills Podcast. My guest today is Bruce Teall, LCSW. Bruce does clinical NLP. In other words, he does NLP as a therapist would, because he is a therapist and he works with people, a lot of people, every week in his practice. So he's going to be talking today about the magic of NLP and how neuroscience would go about explaining it, particularly with the idea of memory consolidation. So I'm really anxious to hear all about this. So here we go. You are listening to the Essential Coaching Skills Podcast, a show devoted to uncovering the systems and the secrets that set the best apart, where you learn how to take your coaching clients to the next level, while you grow the coaching practice of your dreams. So sit back and relax, or sit up and get excited. Either way, you might want to pay attention. This could be important. Good morning, Bruce.
Good morning, Doug. How are you today?
I'm doing very well. And of course, for the listeners or watchers who are doing this, it may not be morning for them. So good afternoon to listeners and evening or whatever it is for you. So, Bruce, you are in Rochester, New York. Is that correct?
I am, or very near there. I'm
very near there.
Yeah. South of there in the rural farmlands of Livingston County.
Nice. And you have a pretty full-time practice doing NLP with clients, but it's actually a clinical therapy practice, though you slip in some NLP when it's
right, yeah. I'm a clinical social worker, and I'm licensed in New York State, and I meet with people as a mental health provider, but a lot of what I do involves NLP.
That's great. And you've also been teaching some clinicians about how to use NLP in their clinical practice.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to do now. I've spent a lot of time. I think my original practitioner certification might have been 1988. So I've spent, and then I graduated from grad school in 96. So I actually did NLP first. And since then, I've been trying to incorporate NLP skills into my practice, because even though NLP started by modeling some psychotherapists, it evolved in a way that didn't always fit neatly with how people do traditional psychotherapy. So right. It's a little bit of a leap there.
Indeed. And some people might be a bit skeptical about it as well these days. I mean, it doesn't have a great write-up on Wikipedia as an example.
No, it doesn't. And,
but you and I also both know how well it works, because we were both involved in the research and recognition project where we did the rewind technique with all those veterans, you more than me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But incredible.
I mean, I don't know how many guys I saw, but I know that there was only one that I know of that didn't accomplish no longer meeting criteria for PTSD. Sorry, science made me say that backwards. That makes sense.
In other words, you cured 99.9% of them.
Yeah, Yeah. So and the bulk of the time I was doing it was 3 sessions or less.
Right. Yeah, and that's the thing also, because we were involved in a study. So the study wants to make sure you get the same dosage per patient sort of thing. So we were only allowed to do 3 sessions, and they were basically do this process over and over again in these 3 sessions. So we weren't just being artful, doing some hypnosis here or something there. It was all do this one rewind technique over and over again. And still incredible techniques, especially compared to what other people were doing at the VA hospital and what these people got. Yeah.
And actually, what's interesting, I was kind of refreshing my memory on the, ironically, memory reconsolidation. And there was a piece that I had not really understood before that actually points to that way of working probably worked better. And I can talk about that a little bit later. But basically, you and I had a discussion once. What's the difference between memory reconsolidation and traditional, extinction or exposure therapies? How does that work differently?
Right.
And one of the differences is how frequently or how long you activate the original memory. and we can get into that a little bit more later, but memory reconsolidation is the neurological action that seems to be at the core a lot of what is considered kind of the magical nature of NLP.
Okay, cool.
You get this
Well,
transformational change.
let's go right ahead and delve into that. So what is memory consolidation? What in fact?
And it's memory reconsolidation, because
Okay,
memory consolidation is the way most of us just think of memory on a day-to-day basis, which is the idea that things happen to us. If there's certain circumstances are met, that memory goes from short-term memory into long-term memory. Okay. So, for instance, brushing your teeth every day, there's nothing unique there. It's not very exciting. There's nothing that's very memorable about it. So it gets blurred in with everything else. But, a surprise birthday party will go into long-term memory because it's unique. It doesn't happen all the time. There's probably a lot of powerful emotions connected to it. So we think about memory in terms of kind of like a camcorder, right? Would be how most people would be a good metaphor or analogy for how memory works. That it records stuff, then we go back, we rewind the tape, and we can review it. Well, it's actually not a very good metaphor for memory, as it turns out. It's much more like how we think about videotape or video recordings, rather, on a computer. Because there's two parts of it that are very much like a computer. One part is when you stream video, it's compressed on one end, comes through the internet, and then you uncompress it to make it the full video on your computer. It's a way to make everything go faster, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, we do a similar thing, but what we do is we use the narrative story as the way to shrink the memory. So say you and I went out to dinner and you were wearing a red tie, and during the course of dinner, you spilled some wine on your shirt, right? Well, the narrative is probably going to be something like, the time I went to dinner with Bruce and I spilled wine on my shirt, right?
Right.
But the fact that you had a red tie is probably a little less important. So that doesn't necessarily get stored.
Mm-hmm.
So if I say to you a leading statement and I say, you remember that time we went to dinner, you were wearing a blue tie and you spilled wine on your shirt, because the tie color wasn't particularly important.
Mm-hmm.
When you decompress that video, so to speak, you'll end up having a memory of having a blue tie instead of a red tie.
Right. Right.
So that's one part of the memory that we don't think about. So that there's lots and lots of these details that aren't really that aren't remembered. They get recreated.
Got it.
The other half of it is that instead of memories being locked in forever, like we once thought, like on the videotape, it's on the recording, we can actually edit it just like you edit video on your computer. So that when we call up the memory, we can make changes to it and then save it back to disk, as it were.
Mm-hmm.
That's the reconsolidation. So every time we remember something, we're actually expanding it, thinking about it, and putting it back. So every time we remember something, we're making some changes to it. Most of them don't really matter much.
Right.
But you can use that strategically in order to make changes on a therapeutic level.
And I'd wager that that's one of the reasons they say that time heals all wounds, because every time you think about it, John Grinder, I think, once said that every access is a reframe. I think it's Grinder that said that. So that basically every time you remember it, you're going through that process of unpacking it, looking at it, repacking it, and then it goes back maybe slightly different than it was the first time.
Absolutely. So it really is the map that we experience, not the territory.
Right. Got it.
And so what the research and recognition folks, Frank Burke and Rick Gray, did was they recognized, Rick in particular recognized, that was the mechanism that was happening in the phobia cure or the movie theater. I mean, it's got a million names, and what had happened, a bunch of us had been using the phobia treatment on traumatic memories. We had recognized that, from one of the main differences between traditional therapy and NLP is the idea of looking at the process, not the content. So at a process level, PTSD and phobias are the same. Content, they're different. So some of us started going, hey, why don't we just use this on trauma? And it was very effective. And we were just kind of doing it quietly in the background, but it had never gotten, rigorously tested by science or anything. So then what Frank and Rick realized is that we could now test it. They could make a protocol out of it. So they took the phobia treatment and a few other pieces of NLP and created this thing they called reconsolidation of traumatic memories, or the RTM protocol. And that's what you and I tested in research. And it was found to be incredibly effective because you're rewriting the memory.
So just to be clear for the listeners who are not familiar with Frank Burke or Rick Gray, they are both PhD types. I believe, I know Frank was, at least, if not still, was at the University of New York at Binghamton. Is that right?
He was a lecturer at Cornell.
Oh, Cornell. Okay. And was Rick involved with the university?
Now, yes, different university. I don't remember which one off the top of my head. It was downstate.
Okay.
Yeah, but he was also teaching.
Okay, so both of these guys are PhDs. So when we talk about research, they really did it right. And one of the exciting things about it is there isn't a lot of research on NLP processes, but this was really done right. They crossed all their T's and dotted all their I's. And
I mean, the only thing that we weren't able to do the first swing through, I don't know where they're at now, is they were all waitlist decides instead of randomized, trials. So that's a couple of notches down on the gold standard thing, but it's still very impressive what we were able to do.
Yeah, indeed.
And they're still cranking along. I don't know what they're up to exactly right now, but they're still, doing trials and doing trainings and.
So I totally get that, how that works as far as memory reconsolidation is concerned. How do you think memory reconsolidation is involved in other NLP processes?
Okay, well, so that's an excellent question, Doug. So let's take a look at how memory reconsolidation works, and then I'll fold it back into that idea, right? So basically, what happens with memory reconsolidation was actually recognized earlier than reconsolidation theory by Bruce Ecker and his a couple other people that he worked with. But Ecker and Tully, his wife, were the first people to identify it as a pattern to use therapeutically. So this is in the early and late 90s. They basically did a modeling project of themselves. Every time they had a session where somebody went through transformational change, and we'll talk about what the criteria were for that in a second, but where they had a clear and significant change, they would watch those videotapes over and over again. So basically they were modeling their own behavior, and they developed this thing that they called eventually the therapeutic reconsolidation process. So by observing therapists getting change, much like Bandler and Grinder modeled Erickson and Satir and Pearls, they identified this underlying neurological process. So then years later, when he was reading about the research, Ecker recognized that they were the same thing. And so basically, the reconsolidation process is, theirs is a little longer, I'm going to simplify it. First, you reactivate the emotional elements of the memory that is bearing the symptoms. So think about it as a trauma case. So somebody is sexually abused. So you just ask them to tune into that memory for a second. Usually we do what's called a SUDS. You scale it from 0 to 10. And just that act of accessing the memory is a reactivation. That then compared with juxtaposition experience, which means you set up a situation where the person has the same trigger but doesn't have the bad experience. That then unlocks that memory and makes it changeable, so that then you keep doing these juxtapositions over and over again, and that's what changes the memory permanently. So in terms of the movie theater, first you have them access the memory and you say 0 to 10, how intense is it? They say 8. Then you set up the double dissociation and they watch the movie go through once. That's the first juxtaposition. That unlocks it. Then you do it a few more times, and those further juxtapositions create the reconsolidation and the memory gets updated. And then over the next few hours, it becomes a permanent memory in the new version.
Okay, cool. And so once again, how does it work with other NLP processes? Like if you did.
So if you look at that, so activate the memory, do some kind of a juxtaposition, right? And then repeat that juxtaposition. Now, John Oberdorf has a thing he calls the meta pattern, which is basically, he says, the pattern underlying all NLP. I think that there's some that it doesn't fit, but by and large, that's most of them. So his is associate into the problem state context, dissociate from the problem state, associate into a resource, and then take the new resource back into the problem state. So collapse, right? So on the one hand, you've got activate memory, juxtaposition, juxtaposition. Associate into the problem context, activate the memory.
Right.
Juxtaposition, a dissociation is already a juxtaposition. You're teaching the person that they can view the memory without feeling it. And then when you add a resource state, that's another juxtaposition and more. Every time you do that, you're doing a reconsolidation. Then afterwards, when you let it go, it stays that way.
Okay.
So in the therapeutic reconsolidation process, the last step he calls verification. And there's three criteria. Emotional non-reaction, meaning when you trigger the event, you fire the trigger, whatever it was, like they think of the memory or think of a dog or whatever you're working on, and they don't react, right? Symptom cessation, meaning if they're in that situation, they don't have that anymore, just on an ongoing way. And effortless permanence, meaning they don't have to practice a skill, it just happens. Well, that's the exact same thing as the test/future pace we do at the end of our patterns, right? That's what you're looking for. You're going, think about asking your boss for a raise. What's it like now? Oh, it's very different. It doesn't feel the same. That's the emotional non-reaction and the symptom cessation, and they do it without effort. So every time you get that makes it likely that a reconsolidation has happened. So think of something like change personal history. So first they access the feeling, so you've activated it.
Okay.
Then you use that in a transderivational search. They go back to an early memory. You have them dissociate from it, right? They see the younger you. So now that's their first, you've activated, you've done one juxtaposition. Then you say, okay, give them this resource. How's that look? There's a juxtaposition. Do they need any more? Every time you do it, it's another juxtaposition. They step into it, different experience, another juxtaposition, and then you bring it up through time. So change personal history.
Let me just stop you there for a quick second, because not everybody that's listening to this show is going to necessarily know what that is, the change personal history process. And just if you don't know what it is one of many NLP processes that have been developed over the years. And in this particular case, going back and changing, it's called change personal history, because you go back into your time, into your personal history, you go back into a memory of something that happened, and you change that movie. You redo it. You have a changed history. And the idea is that human brain doesn't really understand the difference between a memory and a made up story. As long as it's a story that they can see and hear and feel, they can treat it just the same. Brain treats it just the same. So if you do that, if you go back into your personal history and change that, then it can actually change your response to your life story, if you will.
Right.
But that's a oversimplification perhaps, but it is just as people know. So what you do is you start off with a memory of something that happened to you that you don't like, that's been a bad experience for you and has created beliefs about who you are based on that experience you had. And I'm a victim, or I've been bullied, or something like that. And then you go back into that time and say, what resources don't I have now, or didn't I have then that I do have now? Right. And then you bring those resources from now back into that past so you can change that experience. And then you grow up again with a whole changed personal history. So a little bit more succinct, a little bit more explicit description. But that's basically what you do in this change personal history process. So what Bruce is saying is that fits perfectly with both Overdorf's, what's it called again? I'm sorry?
Meta pattern.
Meta pattern. Yeah. And what you're describing with the
therapeutic reconsolidation process. Yes, exactly. The same, very similar ideas. Think about something as straightforward as integrating anchors, right? Collapsing anchors.
Mm-hmm.
So you have a problem state, you anchor it so you can access it. You have a resource, you anchor that, and then you collapse them. Okay, so, and then at the end of it, they kind of even out and the person has a new experience. So when you anchor the first state, you're accessing it. Then when you traditionally have the person dissociate in some way from that, it's a break state, is a dissociation of form, right? Then you get the resource. Then when you fire the anchor and the resource together, that's a juxtaposition. And what's great about this is what NLP has over traditional therapy. So what Ecker and Hulley do is they call it coherence therapy, right? And I'm not trained in it, I don't know a ton about it, but it's a very nice type of therapy, but it's embedded in content. What's really interesting about NLP is when you start looking at things from a state standpoint, then reconsolidation is much more straightforward, because you just have to have somebody presented with a trigger, but a different experience. Because what a juxtaposition is, our brains are always trying to predict what's coming for our survival. So we have this response where, we eat berries, they make us sick. So the next time we see the berries, we feel sick to help us not die, right? So same thing here, except for we've evolved the frontal lobe. We can remember the berries. We don't need to have that emotional level response anymore. We can respond intellectually. So what we can do is, if you look at it from an anchor standpoint or from a state standpoint, it's see berries, have bad feeling, because we don't want to eat the berries again. But now we can see the berries, recognize that we shouldn't eat them, and we can have a different feeling. We don't have to suffer through that bad feeling all the time. So if you start seeing the meta pattern, for instance, so you're activating the memory by associating into it, it's the state that is the juxtaposition switch. Then the next time when they think of the trigger, you fire the anchor, it changes the experience, and that's why it unlocks it.
I love it. I love it. And that's a really good distinction, to say that it is the state rather than the story, if you will.
That's how I see it. I mean, you can do it either way, but to me, the state is a much more straightforward way to use this knowledge.
No, I get it. I believe that. True. That's true. Yeah. And it's really interesting because, I've been doing the havening techniques now for a number of years, and that again seems to be right in line with what you're describing, because that's basically what we do. We get a SUDS level, we activate the memory, we get a SUDS description of it, and then we break the state by doing the havening touch and do juxtapositions. You're walking down the beach, you're in these different juxtapositions, and the same thing happens. And interestingly, speaking of having just the idea of consolidation, memory reconsolidation, I had an experience once when I was back in college. When I was a music major, I was learning to play a particular piece on the piano, and I was having a devil of a time for particularly this one section of the development section of a Beethoven sonata, and it was just very difficult. And I practiced and practiced and practiced and practiced and practiced and practiced, and I wasn't getting anywhere. And then one day I was practicing and not succeeding, and I got really sleepy. And I fell asleep on the floor of the practice room. I just lay down and went to sleep on the floor of the practice room. And I dreamt that I could play this piece. I dreamt it was flawless. It was just easy, just just easy. And then I woke up and I said, "Oh, how foolish of me to fall asleep in the practice room floor." And I got up and I turned the light back on, and I could play it. And I never was not able to play it after that. It was always easy for me, just like in the dream. I told that story to Dr. Rudin, the creator of the Havening techniques, and he just said, "Memory reconsolidation." He might have actually said memory consolidation, but yeah.
Could be. The other part of that I would wonder about is there's a lot of research that dreaming has an integrative function for us.
Mm-hmm.
So for instance, there's a lot of studies where they've shown you take a group of people, you present a bunch of material to them, randomly assign them to two groups. One group stays, takes a test on the material. The other group, the next day, takes a test on the material. And statistically, the group that sleeps on it does better. So even though they just learn the material, something about how we dream and think integrates material. So,
yeah.
Again, it could be.
So maybe we should just have them sleep right there in the classroom before they take the test.
So.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so many pieces to that stuff. That's why it's very hard to do research on people, or just very complex.
Yeah.
There's similar studies where if you take your final exam in the room that you learned the material, you score better than if you take it in a separate location.
Right.
Most schools around here, at least, it's pretty common that you take all your finals in a different room.
For sure. Yeah. The state dependent learning about that. So how is this affected? How is this realization that you've had about how pretty much all these NLP processes could be looked at through the lens of memory reconsolidation? How has that affected your work with people?
Well, I think pretty significant, really, and often just in having an additional framework. Like, I don't look for the truth anymore. I'm too old for that. I just look for what is helpful or what works, right? And whether reconsolidation is a thing or if it's just to me, that doesn't matter, right? Like, I don't care about which neurons are doing what. I'm not a brain guy in that way. I like the practical applications. And this just gives me, I think of all models in therapy, whether it's NLP or Freudian therapy or object relations, it doesn't matter to me. They're all just, I think of them like overlays, right? Like latitude and longitude, right? They're not real, but they're certainly helpful, right? And in the same way, I think of these models as helping me navigate the territory. So with this reconsolidation idea, it really helps you start to go, oh, okay, that's what's going on here. And you know where you are in the process, which is really helpful. Especially with NLP stuff, that overnerf idea, I think, is really helpful because you go, okay, did I successfully get them into state? Because for a lot of this stuff, if the person can't experience the problem, it's very hard to get really good change, transformational change.
Yeah.
Which transformational change is, it happens in the session. They don't have to practice. It's, now there's nothing wrong with, change that you bring about in other ways, but it's a different thing. Like, for instance, I had a session with a client that had an experience where he was in an African country working for something kind of like Peace Corps or AmeriCorps, something like this, quite a while ago. And he was riding his bike back to where he was living at night in the dark. And this is Africa. It's not like there's a lot of street lights and stuff. He has this very freak accident where he's riding along in his bike and another guy in another bike, and they literally hit tire to tire and go like this.
Oh my God.
My patient had a helmet on and the other guy did not. And he hit the guy and gave him a brain injury, right? So my patient knew enough to put him into the rescue position, right? And then go find help. By the time they came back, the guy had died. So now he's in a country in Africa, and they want his head it just became crazy. And a local diplomat kind of had him extricated and pulled out of the country. So in the midst of all this, the client had developed a belief that he ran away from problems, right?
Okay.
And so we were just starting to work on this, and the next session when he came in, he had an event happen that was kind of dramatic, and it was on Facebook, and his old scout leader had said to him, "Boy Scouts to the rescue," or "Scouts to the rescue," right? And he was really pumped about this. So I said, "Oh, okay, well, let's go work on that memory." So same thing, I had associate into the feeling, had him step out and say, now let's watch the accident from over here. And then he saw the event, and when it felt, I said, "Oh, look, Scouts to the rescue." And his expression changed, and I said, "Oh, you weren't running away from the problem. You were a hero in this." And that's the reframe, right? That got the juxtaposition.
Mm-hmm.
A couple of more things, but in that moment, I could see it happen. You see the change, And so knowing where you're at in that process helps with that idea. Because you can make a change at an intellectual level, right? I could have talked through him about all that and made those points on an intellectual level. And over time, he may have worked his way through it. I don't know. But I know that once we did that memory reconsolidation, kind of like when Grinder said every time you remember, it's a reframe.
That's basically what
Every
he said.
access is a reframe.
Every access is a reframe.
And that, in a sense, that's what that was. I just guided it a little by picking the words.
It's also really interesting that you in a sense changed the story. We were talking before about the stories that people tell each other. Change personal history is a story about what happened back then, and so the stories that we tell each other, talk to ourselves about. And change can happen just on the feeling level, but we tend to think in terms of words and stories and a narrative type of thing. So that if you can,
I think though that it's easier to change the story after you've changed the feeling.
Right. Oh, absolutely.
Traditional therapy goes at it the other way. They're trying to work on the story, hoping to change the feeling, which also works. I mean, there are two levers. All this stuff is like a mobile,
Yeah. No, that's absolutely true. And, the first time I ever saw Havening demonstrated, it was really amazing because the woman, when she first said what happened on 9/11, she was like, "I'm in the building." She was totally associated to the memory, to the experience. And she was back in the building. And then after 10 minutes, 15 minutes of havening, and she was, on this, there's the SUDS has gone down to a 0.
And to go back to that point about, we talked about doing the research. You just come in, you do that one technique. It's a different kind of way of doing it. And I don't know if that was a demonstration. I remember one time you telling me about Dr.
But I was going to just finish up here is that after the technique was done, then the therapist asked, "So what happened on 9/11?" And she had a very different representation. Instead of being in the building, now she was totally dissociated. The event was like on a screen happening over there, and I'm watching it from a distance. So everything, all those submodalities had shifted quite dramatically.
Right. Yeah. And so, is it, so what I believe is that if that same person had gone to a traditional therapist and had a good outcome. May have taken longer, whatever, but in the end, if she got asked the same questions, she'd have the same response.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I think
I can imagine an NLP process where you say, okay, take that memory and move it over there, and you can go through.
And what I've always liked about NLP is that it's got that precision involved. That it doesn't just end up out there. We go, put it over there. Just a different way of doing it. The other thing is, I had kind of teased it up top, the idea of extinction versus using exposure. When you use exposure, the difference is that with memory reconsolidation, the original memory is changed. It's no longer the same memory. With when you're using exposure, what happens is the original memory stays there, but you add a bunch of benign memories and experiences in between, so that the person most of the time doesn't access them. But the problem with exposure is that original memory is still there. So if something is strong enough to connect to it, then the symptoms return. And part of what seems to make the difference is the accessing sequence. That if you access the state briefly, if you activate the memory briefly, reconsolidation occurs. But if you hold the activation for a long time and then do the juxtapositions, then you get the exposure version. So actually not spending a lot of time talking about the problem is helpful.
Yeah, it's interesting. A number of years ago, very well-intended and good-hearted people went to a refugee camp in Lesbos, Greece, to work with the Syrian refugees that were camped there. And the ones I'm referring to right now were havening practitioners, and they had a very, very good outcome with the work that they did there. But they were very careful not to, do too much about saying, the trauma is past. Let's think about how we can reconsolidate this, because they were still in the trauma. It was still happening right here, right now. But they were almost not allowed to come to the camp, because previously there had been also well-intentioned, good-hearted people who had come there to do the same thing, but practiced EMDR. And with the EMDR process, they kept thinking about the trauma. Think about the trauma. Think about the trauma, and move your eyes around. So they didn't do well.
And it's how you do it, but EMDR, when it works well, you can track it back to reconsolidation.
I believe
and that's the value of understanding this framework, that you can do NLP and not achieve reconciliation. You can do EMDR and not achieve reconciliation. And that's part of why the results can be, iffy.
Right.
So,
yeah. So, yeah, part of it, of course, is, how do you change the pictures of something and move it over there if the picture is actually right there in front of you, happening at the very moment? You can't really.
Right. I mean, and not one technique does it.
Yeah.
True.
Maybe
if somebody had taught those folks how to dissociate in the moment, it would have been helpful.
Yeah, right. Interestingly, one of the only failures I had with a research and recognition project was a soldier who had dissociated very handily during the situation, that he was in back in Afghanistan. So he survived through the ability to dissociate. But when we tried to do the reconsolidation protocols with him, he couldn't associate to the event. He couldn't bring it up, so he couldn't associate into it. He couldn't ever get his SUDS up to anything beyond like 1.
Right.
And I don't even think of it as even a 1, actually.
Yeah. Right. If I always, when I ask somebody, if you think about it, can you access this feeling or remember or whatever? And they're like, hey, yeah. I'm like, oh, that's okay. That's the good news.
Yeah, right.
that puts you in the camp that I'm more likely to be able to help.
Yeah. exactly.
Yeah, I had a similar thing when we did in the research project. We got together with all the people on the board of directors to kind of do an in-service sort of and teach them about this stuff. And we broke out into groups to have people experience the RTM. And in my group was a guy that was very high up, like a rear admiral or something like that, or I think he was a Navy pilot at one point. But he had figured out how to do RTM on his own. Basically, I went back and all his memories were already dissociated. So I was like, "Yeah, you don't need this, pal." So most people cope; they figure out a way.
Yeah.
It's always important when you talk about trauma to remind people that 85 to 95% of people in any instance are going to be fine. When 9/11 happened and they opened clinics all over New York and nobody went because they were fine.
Interesting. So what's the takeaway here, Bruce? What do we need to know about reconsolidation process to become better NLPers or better therapists?
Right. I think understanding you don't have to know it at a neurological level, but if you can understand that basic framework of, activate and then expose a juxtaposition, and that just means it's different than what they expect.
So give me a practical example of what that would mean.
A juxtaposition?
Yeah.
Okay.
Like,
So
an actual example.
Yeah. All right. So let me think of a case I've done lately. I mean, the RTM is the easiest one for any of those. So if you think about that protocol, the first half of it is the fast phobia cure. So you activate the memory when you get a SUDS. Then when they watch the memory doubly dissociated and they can watch it but not have strong feelings, that's a juxtaposition. Then because you've done the dissociation, the black and white, all that, then when they do the colorful rewind and they're associated, each one of those is a juxtaposition because it's not what they expect to have happen.
Mm-hmm.
These are all on process level. We haven't changed the content of the memory at all.
Right.
And then so that you get it pretty close to a zero. Then we do the alternative memory aspect of it, which is kind of like a new behavior generator, basically, or a change personal history. They watch the memory, but we update it in a way that is more helpful. So when they do that, that's another juxtaposition.
So that's another juxtaposition. So the RTM protocol actually has two parts to it, really, doesn't it?
It does, yeah.
So the one part of it is to perturb the system that was creating the bad feelings, so how the system worked in order to create the feeling of trauma. And then once we did that a few times, went back and forth and reconsolidated, so it was down to a pretty low level, then we actually had them watch the movie. So instead of not watching the movie like they did the first time around, now they're actually watching the movie, seeing the content in real time, going forward.
You could even see that as a juxtaposition the first time they watch it. And then you ask them the question, is there anything that if you'd have done differently would have been helpful, or something that, if you'd known it ahead of time, are usually the things that I suggest for people. But there's people that do reconsolidation work outside of NLP, and they can be a little more liberal on the criteria for that. They'll have Superman fly in and rescue them and stuff like that. I don't really try. If I can find something that they could do differently, or if they had known it ahead, I usually go with those, because then that gives them an opportunity to learn something. The other option that we do sometimes is like you pretend it's a movie or something like that.
Right.
But all of those, again, it's just for them to be able to watch that memory, but have a different experience.
Right.
As long as the experience is different, then the rest takes care of itself.
Absolutely. So again, people who are coaches listening to this, people who are therapists listening to this, what would be if you could say, okay, I hope they learned this one thing.
I think the one thing would be that memory is changeable in positive ways, and you're going to be doing it anyway. So learn what you're doing, right? That, like when I was in grad school, they used to go, don't influence your clients, be a blank slate. That's nonsense. You can't not influence people. Just being there is an influence. Own it. Know what you're doing, right? Same thing here. You're going to be changing people's memory. Don't pretend you can't. Learn how. There's a really nice article that Ecker did. I think it's called Memory Reconsolidation, Understood and Misunderstood. And he published somewhere, but I'll send you the link so you can put it in the show notes. It's a little technical, but it's got a lot of really good information in there that this. I think that this is where therapy is heading in a lot of ways, because it's what makes these changes that really stick,
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And it's interesting because when you think about it as well, with hypnosis, when you do a sort of guided imagery in hypnosis, you're doing, again, the juxtaposition thing happening.
There's a lot of this fits the hypnotic model incredibly well.
Yeah.
It's absolutely, you're giving people alternate experiences. That's what it's about. Right. It's when you expect to be scared, but you're not. You expect to be, scared, but you're happy. You expect it's that. And if it makes perfect sense why this works, right? This is better than it's like our software can program itself. It's pretty amazing.
So this show is called the Essential Coaching Skills Podcast. And a lot of the listeners probably are coaches or interested
one might think.
Interested certainly in coaching. In coaching, since you're not like doing therapy per se, can this still be a valuable way of thinking?
Oh, absolutely. Because the only difference, I think, between therapy and coaching is it's the client. It's not the provider. The coaches and therapists use basically the same tool set, and you're just dealing with different things. But if you take any kind of presenting problem, there's going to be a behavioral component to it, right? So, and I assume that since a lot of coaches use NLP techniques, that there's memory reconsolidation involved.
Yeah. And, it's also funny, I remember a few elections ago, Mitt Romney got in trouble for saying that corporations are people too. I think he was talking more from a legalistic point of view, but in a way, they are. I mean, businesses, corporations. I mean, they're obviously filled with human beings, and the way that they function as a result of how the humans are functioning within the corporations. So, I mean, one could also think organizational psychology or other systems psychology to go into a corporate setting and understand the same process. Would seem like. What do you think?
I think so. I mean, it wouldn't be at that point, you're not looking at a neurological piece.
Right.
But I think the basic idea holds true. That for a while, it was really big to talk about learning organizations, right? And this is really a model of learning, that our brains are designed so that if something bad happens, we'll remember it and not repeat it. But it's also designed that if we're in a similar circumstance and we don't have the problem, it can update the file so that it doesn't assume that every X is bad. So in the same way, when you have an organization that's going, okay, we keep doing the same thing and we get a bad result, we need to update our institutional memory, in effect.
Yeah, there you go. I like that. Yeah. So it's this. The system is basically the same, although it's not an organism, so it's not going to have the same, exact structure. But
you could. I mean, what's an organization? It's a set of rules, both written and mostly not written. So if you change those rules to act in a similar way to reconsolidation, it would work.
Great. Well, thank you, Bruce. So people are hoping to, I'm hoping that people will listen to this and listen to how NLP does work really well and does work really well in clinical settings as a therapist. You're attempting to teach that? Are you teaching any more of
I'm
those?
putting together some coursework on it now, but what I'll do is I'll post some handouts, or I'll give you I'll give you information so you can make the handouts available to people. It'll have some of this information to give them a place to get started on it.
Great.
I'll have my email if they want to ask me questions. I'm always happy to answer stuff.
Put that all in the show notes. Brilliant.
Sounds good.
All right. Thank you very much. This has been fascinating.
It has been fun.
Yeah. I'm always the kind of guy who likes to see the overview structure of things so that you can, go from there into the details. But it gives me a roadmap, if you will, of
right. And what are plans are they're not really how you're going to do it. They tell you when you're not on track. They're more like guardrails, really.
Huh.
So I like to have a framework. So I'm like, this is Europe. I'm supposed to be in South America.
Yeah, right.
Some I never should have taken that right in Albuquerque or whatever.
Great metaphor. Well, thank you very much for your time. Appreciate you being here.
My pleasure. Bye-bye.
Bye. This has been the Essential Coaching Skills Podcast. Thank you for being here. It's a pleasure seeing you again. Hope to see you again real soon. Come back next week when we have another gripping and exciting episode of the Essential Coaching Skills Podcast. And if you want to, you can find out more about us, each and every one of us, at essentialcoachingskills.com. Thanks.